Hey everyone, I'm Ross. I'm the student pastor here at Fellowship, and I'm here to continue our series, God with Us, this morning. And to begin, I gotta admit something I hate about Christmas. And I know what you're thinking, how could you put hate and Christmas in the same sentence? And this is gonna make me sound a little bit like a Scrooge, but I really dislike gift giving. And the truth is, I don't care about receiving. It ain't my, love language. I don't feel appreciated. I kind of fail to show appreciation when somebody gets me a gift. And really, it's because I don't need anything. I don't want anything. And also, I'm not trying to be haughty, but, I rather someone else be blessed with a gift or the money that you're going to use than to get me anything. And I also don't like the gift giving part. And that's not about the giving part, or honestly, it doesn't stem from greed or wanting to hold on to my money. I'm not saying we aren't spoiling my daughter Ellie this Christmas, because we are. I think what I'm trying to say, and maybe some of you would agree, is I just dislike the consumeristic part of Christmas, the capitalistic, the advertisementistic nature of it all kind of takes me out of it. It brings some stress, it invokes stress into my life. What am I going to get this person? What am I going to buy them? What do I want when they ask me what I want for Christmas? There's just so many things to choose from. What do I need? What do I want? And then you have all these commercials being thrown at you, from the jewelry commercials, and we know that every kiss begins with K. And I'm like, well, I guess my wife Isabel, she needs diamonds to make her happy. And if I don't get that for her, then I'm a bad husband. And who can forget car commercials when the spouse comes outside and there's a brand new car with a giant bow on it. And first of all, it makes me wonder, does this actually happen? Who's out here buying cars for their spouse, brand new ones on Christmas Day? And second of all, don't you think it might be a little irresponsible to make such a big purchase without first deciding that as a couple? Well, anyway, of course, me saying I dislike gift giving is just a bit of a shock factor in trying to capture your attention today. On the other hand, I am trying to highlight the reality that we do live in an age driven by the economics of conspicuous consumption. We want our kids to behave nicely in order to receive something they desire from Santa. We make wish lists of what we want. We make lists of stuff we need to buy for others. And the question is the same each year. What do you want for Christmas? And of course, this is more than just about Christmas. Consumerism is more than just our economic system. It is a belief system. Consumption, having things, has come to define our lives, our government, and even our faith, our spirituality, and how we relate to God. Scott McKnight is a professor of religious studies at North Park College in Chicago. And every semester he gives his students a test on the first day of his Jesus class. And he asks questions, 24 questions to his students of what they think Jesus is like, his personality, what and how he thinks. And then that test is followed by another 24 question test in which he asks students, what do they think about themselves? What's their personality? How do they think? And the results are remarkable, Scott says. Everyone thinks that Jesus is just like them. Naturally, this test exposes our tendency to project our identities onto God. We assign him our personalities, our values, and our biases. So, when we look at the God ink blot, as he likes to call his test, most people are going to project their own consumer values and identities onto the divine. And what emerges is the life from God posture, where we look to God as the source, as the expectation of providing everything I want, everything I desire, providing the happiness in my life. We look to God, and that's why it's called the life from God posture, because we take this approach where we are expecting God to provide me exactly what I want in order to make me happy. As you know, in this series, we are taking a look at all these different postures that we can have towards God that lead us into an incorrect way to relate to him and have a relationship. As Americans, I think we can admit that it's common for us to hold a consumer worldview. According to New York Times, each person is exposed to 3,500 desire-inducing advertisements every day. We are conditioned to constantly believe we have unmet needs that can only be appeased by commodified goods and experiences. And if people began to suppress their desires and they consumed only what they need, our economy would collapse. And so to prevent this, feeding into our desires has become sacrosanct, meaning it's become sacred. It can't be questioned. It can't be criticized in the way that our society and our economy runs. It's all based on us having desires and wants and trying to fulfill our needs with buying stuff. And therefore, we tend to believe in a God who exists to satisfy our consumer desires as well. The life from God posture starts by assuming that the way we see the world is how God sees the world. And therefore, what we desire for our lives, God must also desire for our lives. However, I don't want to be dismissive because there is some merit to this view of God. Scripture reminds us repeatedly that all we have comes from God. Just like it says in the book of James, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. Jesus instructs us to ask God for what we need. One of the titles of God is Jehovah Jireh, God the provider. But this life from God posture has the tendency to be overemphasized. The gift becomes more important than the gift giver. So much to the point where it's no longer about provision for our needs, but for all our desires, our comfort and expectations become thrusted upon God. Every commodity is measured by its usefulness. Think about stuff that you own. If it's no longer useful to you, hopefully if you're not hoarding it, if it's no longer useful to you, what do? You buy a new one or you throw away the old one. Sometimes we even do this with people in our lives. If they're no longer useful to us, we may cut them out. And really, we base the inherent worth of people and objects we have based on its usefulness. That's what happens in a consumerism worldview. And so God's value then becomes determined by his usefulness. What have you done for me lately? Could be the mantra of the life from God posture. And our belief in Jesus just becomes a means to an end, another spiritual method of achieving our own desires, navigating throughout the world, having to have correct expectations to confirm what we believe. We use God to confirm a life of comfort, to make things more easy for us. So where does this all come from? Well, just like the life over God posture we talked about last week, it all comes from fear and our need for control. See, rather than looking to God to remove our fears and pains, consumerism tries to distract us from them. And comfort, rather than deliverance, becomes our ultimate goal. We're looking for the stuff, we're looking for fulfilling our desires in order to distract us from our pains, our suffering, our discomfort. And we start to think, well, God must exist to supply me with what I need or desire in this moment to overcome what's making me feel uncomfortable, uncertain, or afraid. That is what the life from God posture does. It kind of reminds me of what author and thinker C.S. Lewis says. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. See, much of the time we are trying to subdue our discomfort. We're trying to distract ourselves from the pain in our lives, and we do that through consuming different commodities. We do that through buying stuff. We do that by looking to God for him to provide me with the happiness I think I'm entitled to. But the reality is, it's in our pain, it's in our struggle, it's in our discomfort where God speaks to us the loudest. See, this reminds me of the Apostle Paul, where he talks about how he was given a thorn in his side, and that was just an expression to say that he had some sort of ailment, a struggle, a discomfort, a pain. And it says in the book of Corinthians that he begged the Lord 3 different times to take it away. He says, God, take this away from me. I don't want it anymore. And in verse 9, Jesus replies and says, My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. And Paul says, so now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. See, Paul looked to God to take away his discomfort, take away that pain, take away that suffering, but that was a life from God approach. And Jesus' response and what Paul found out was, you know what? It's through my pain, it's through my discomfort that I am the strongest. That is the moment where God can work through me the most, where his power shines. And when you start to realize that instead of a life from God posture, you move to a life with God posture, that we realize his grace is all we need in this life. See, our discomfort and pain awakens our souls to seek a beauty, a justice, and a freedom beyond what this present world can provide. This also reminds me of what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12. He begins by talking about parental discipline. He says this in verse 7, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? So he gets into this beautiful imagery of just like if you're a parent watching today, just as you discipline your children, you do that out of love, right? You do that out of protection. You do that to teach lessons when your child does something they shouldn't. You do that to correct them, to get them back on the right path. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying, hey, if you earthly parents, you earthly fathers, discipline your children, right? You're doing that out of love. You're doing that out of protection. Could you imagine if you gave your child everything they ever wanted? Could you imagine if you never corrected them for a wrongdoing? Could you imagine if you never disciplined them? What would happen in your child's life? See, discipline is always done out of love. And so he goes on in verse 10, he says, for our earthly fathers disciplined us for a few years, doing the best they know. But God's discipline is always good for us, so that we might share in his holiness. He goes on to say, no discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields a harvest of righteousness and peace to those who have been trained by it. He says, listen, when you're in the midst of discipline, when you discipline your child, you know that you're making them unhappy, you're causing them discomfort, you're going to cause them to maybe scream or throw a tantrum, but you know it's for their best, even though in that moment it's painful. And we know that to discipline our children, we can't forfeit the need to make them happy, right? A loving father, a loving mother is going to discipline their children because they know what's best. And earthly fathers, they do the best they can, but the writer of Hebrews says, hey, every time God disciplines, the hardships that we have can all be used for good. Here's the thing, and here's what God knows. It's in our comfort where we can forget the one alone who can deliver us. It's in our comfort where we become distracted and start to feel like we don't have a need for God anymore. We see in the Old Testament that God would warn his ancient people, the Israelites, about the dangers of comfort. While slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, the Hebrew people cried out for God to deliver them, to rescue them. And until one day, God heard their cries and heard their prayers, and he sent Moses to rescue his people out of the land of Egypt. And after rescuing them and leading them to the promised land, God cautioned them not to forget once they were comfortable. It says this in Deuteronomy 8, but that is the time to be careful. Beware that in your plenty you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, regulations, and decrees that I am giving you today. For when you have become full and prosperous and have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large, and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. If you know anything about the Old Testament, then you know that again and again Israel turned away from God in times of prosperity and peace. And this became a cycle, a pattern. The comforts distracted the people from remembering and from seeking God himself. They looked to distraction, they looked for pleasures, they looked for comfort, and they began to turn away from God. And so began this cycle where people would cry out to God for deliverance. God would deliver them. They'd praise God, and then time would pass. They would forget. While in their comfort, they would turn to other things and other gods, and then they would be disciplined. God would hand them over to another nation, and then once again, they would cry out for deliverance through that discipline. And this would happen, the cycle would happen until one day Jesus would come, where God would say, you know what, enough's enough. The time is right. I'm sending my son. I need to be with my people. I need to be with my creation. You know, in this series, and as we approach Christmas, we want to turn to the correct posture, life with God, because God is with us. And that is really the question to ask ourselves this Christmas. As we marvel and contemplate the beautiful reality of God being with us, that he went to great lengths by sending his son to demonstrate, I want to be with you. I want to live life with my creation, with my children. While we contemplate the beauty of that, we have to ask ourselves the question, if God is with us, am I living with a posture of life with him? See, this life with God posture, the goal is not to use God. The goal is God. He ceases to be a device we employ or a commodity we consume. Instead, God himself becomes our desire. Our underlying concern through this life with God posture in opposition to the life from God posture is that my comfort, what I desire, is not only not guaranteed, it's not the goal. And don't get me wrong here, because like we addressed, God does give gifts. He gives us rest for our souls. He is a provider. He does care for you. But much of that is predicated on having a posture of life with God. Think about Matthew 6:33, where Jesus says to seek first the kingdom of God, and then he'll provide our needs. I think of Psalm 37:4, where it says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. Much of the provision and care that God provides is predicated on whether I am living with a posture of life with God. See, our relationship and life with him is more than the expectation of God's going to meet my needs, my happiness, and my desires, or to even think that my own happiness is of greater concern than that of my call to glorify God, learn obedience, and to serve others. You know, I think much of Jesus' birth into this world, let alone his entire ministry, could be categorized as uncomfortable. The king of our lives was born in a cave, wrapped in rags, placed in a feeding trough that was made out of stone. He was from a town of little significance, and for the first 2 years of his life, his parents had to flee with him to another nation because some maniac was killing boys under the age of 2, trying to find and kill the Messiah. Man, when I think of Jesus' birth and his arrival here on this planet, I don't think of comfort. I don't think of happiness like we imagine the nativity scene. I think of messiness. I think of struggle. I think of discomfort. And later on in his ministry, Jesus would say things like, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve others and to give his life a ransom for many. He's creating these expectations. I'm not here to be served. I'm here to serve others and to give my life. And as in his ministry, Jesus would often challenge the posture of the people who wanted to follow them. He often asked what they were willing to leave behind in order to have this posture of life with him. With these difficult and sometimes offensive questions, Jesus was determining whether they were truly interested in him and a life with him, or just in what he might do for them. We find this occurring in Matthew chapter 8. It says this in verse 18. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he instructed his disciples to cross to the other side of the lake. Then one of the teachers of the religious law said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. But Jesus replied, Foxes have dens to live in, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head. I think we can, glance past this really quick and miss the meaning here. We sometimes look at this and we're like, okay, Jesus is just saying, I'm homeless. If you want to follow me, you're not going to have a home to live in. But what's happening here is way more significant. See, this man asking and telling Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go, was a teacher of the religious law. He came from a wealthy lifestyle. And not only that, his belief and his posture was a life from God posture, meaning scholars believe when they look into this and they study this, that this teacher of the religious law expected that by following Jesus, Jesus would overthrow Rome, set up his kingdom, and this guy was looking for what he could get from him if he were to follow him. So Jesus read into that. He knew this religious leader and teacher's heart, and he says, hey, the Son of Man, the Messiah, doesn't have a place to lay his head. All these other animals do, but I don't. Don't think this life of following me wherever I go is going to guarantee what you're looking for. You need to change your approach. Verse 21, another of his disciples said, Lord, first let me return home and bury my father. But Jesus told him, follow me now. Let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. We can look at this and be like, whoa, that's pretty harsh, Jesus. Like, you're just saying, it doesn't seem like you're being really sensitive to what's going on in this guy's family to say, follow me, forget about your dead dad and come be with me. No, you got to look into this and understand this a little more. See, this man was also living from a life from God posture. Scholars believe when they read into this and they interpret this, that this man was saying, hey, I want to first wait till my father passes so I can receive my inheritance. And then I'll come follow you, God. I'll come follow you, Jesus, now that I'm comfortable and have the desires that I'm looking for. And Jesus was like, hey, no. Follow me now. Change from this life from God posture to a life with God. See, it would be so easy, and honestly would make our jobs so easy as pastors here at Fellowship, with our culture being so consumeristic, to treat Jesus like a product and just say, hey, if you have this product, then you'll be happier. You'll get what you want. You'll be more comfortable. God exists to fulfill your needs, to fulfill your happiness. And though we do believe much of following Jesus will do that, just consequently, unfortunately, some churches in our world do preach this and treat our King like a product. But here's what I know. Here's what I know is the truth as well, is that a life of following Jesus, a life with God posture, will have trouble. It will have trials. It will have suffering. It will have fatherly discipline. It will have discomfort. But I also know this, that a life with Jesus, a life with God posture, will have unexplainable joy. It will have peace that surpasses all understanding. It will have thrills of hope. It will have loving provision. And it will have inseparable, unconditional love. God with us is what we celebrate every Christmas. And we need to ask ourselves the questions. We need to be challenged just as Jesus challenged these people who wanted to be with him. Are we living from a life from God posture? Do we live with the expectation that God exists to satisfy my desires, to give me a life of happiness and comfort? Or do I want to switch to a life with God posture? That by following him, sometimes life may be difficult. Life may be hard, there may be pain, but all that is to draw us to him. That it's within that stuff. Instead of looking for distraction, let's look for deliverance from God. Let's become aware that his grace is all we need, and it's in our discomfort where his power shines through us the most. You know, this entire series is based on a book called With by Skye Jethani, and I want to read a passage he writes in the book to conclude for today. It is only when we live with God and come to experientially know his goodness and love that shadows break and his commands begin to make sense. If I am eternally safe in the care of my good shepherd, and I come to see the world as a safe place, then I am set free of my fears. I am free to give rather than to hoard. I am free to enjoy each day rather than to worry. I am free to forgive others rather than retaliate against them. And I am free to love the person determined to harm me. But all of it starts with the truth and faith in God's ever-present love and care for me.